Why did you call the FBI while on a vacation? I had been planning this trip for almost a year. My mom, Diane, just turned 72, and she had been wanting to go on a cruise since my dad passed. I saved up and booked us a balcony cabin on the Pacific Crown so she could finally have her dream vacation. On the third morning of the cruise, I woke up around 8 a.m. and noticed Mom wasn't in her bed. She liked to go up early to the buffet, so I figured she'd be back soon. About an hour later, she came back into the room walking funny, holding her left arm against her body. When she sat down on the edge of the bed, she winced like it really hurt. I asked her what was wrong, and she pulled up her sleeve. There was a huge purple bruise running from her wrist all the way up past her elbow. The same dark bruising was on her hip too. I jumped up from the bed and asked her what happened. Mom told me she had been carrying her plate up the buffet stairs when a crew member rushing past her with a cart shoved her against the railing. She fell hard onto the metal stairs. A different crew member helped her up and walked her down to a chair, gave her a wet napkin and told her to go lie down. Nobody asked her name. Nobody filled out any paperwork. Nobody called for the medical team. I asked Mom why she didn't come find me right away. She said the woman who walked her downstairs told her not to make a big deal out of it because the crew member who bumped her didn't mean to. That's when I got dressed and walked out of the cabin. The first person I found was our cabin steward, a guy named Dimitri, who was wiping down the doorknobs in the hallway. I asked him if he had heard about an elderly woman falling on the buffet stairs that morning. Dimitri shook his head and said no. I told him I knew he had a radio and that crew talked on the radios all morning. Dimitri said, "Sir, I clean cabins. I don't listen to other departments." I went down to the medical center next. The nurse on duty checked her computer and told me there was no record of any 72-year-old woman being treated or even visiting that morning. I asked her if she could check whether any incident report had been filed for the buffet area. She said reports went through guest services, not medical. I went down 2 decks to guest services. There was a woman behind the counter named Janelle. I told her exactly what happened to my mom, the rushing crew member, the cart, the fall on the stairs, and the staff member who walked her back to her room without filing anything. Janelle typed for about 10 seconds and told me there was no incident report on file for that morning. I asked her to file one now. Janelle smiled at me with her teeth showing and said, "Sir, if it didn't get reported in the moment, it's pretty much your mother's word against ours, and we have to be really careful about claims like that." I asked her if she was calling my 72-year-old mother a liar. Janelle told me she wasn't calling anybody anything, but that older guests sometimes got confused about how minor trips happened. There was that word, confused. First time it stung, but I held it together. While I was standing there, an older man behind me in line tapped my shoulder and said his wife had also slipped near that same buffet stairs the day before, and that nobody had filed anything for her either. I asked Janelle to get me her supervisor. The supervisor was a guy named Mr. Vance, and he had 4 stripes on his shoulder, so I figured he was high up. Mr. Vance walked over and shook my hand like we were friends. "What can I do for you, buddy?" he asked. I told him everything from the start, including the older man's wife from the day before. Mr. Vance nodded the whole time like he was really listening, and then he said, "I really do appreciate you bringing this to my attention, but I have to be honest with you, buddy. The buffet stairs are wide, well lit, and have handrails on both sides. When elderly guests get confused on stairs, sometimes they think they were pushed when they really just lost their footing." Second time I heard the word confused, and that was it. I told Mr. Vance my mother had raised 3 kids, run a household for 50 years, and was sharper than anyone on this ship. I told him if a real incident report wasn't filed in the next 10 minutes, I would call the FBI Maritime Crimes Hotline from the cabin phone. Mr. Vance's smile didn't move, but his eyes flicked over my shoulder, and I heard 2 sets of boots stop walking right behind me. A hand the size of a dinner plate landed on my shoulder, and a voice said, "Follow us, buddy. We're going to discuss the threat you just made against the vessel." So 2 security guards just grabbed me in the middle of guest services like I was the one who did something wrong. My 72-year-old mother was sitting upstairs with a bruise the size of a football on her arm, and I was the problem. But here's what Mr. Vance didn't know. My dad, Mahmoud, spent 30 years working for the Coast Guard before he passed. I grew up hearing about maritime law at the dinner table, the way most kids heard about sports. They were about to take me to some back office thinking they could scare me quiet. They picked the wrong family. The 2 guards walked me through a door marked crew only, and down a long corridor I didn't even know existed. Just gray walls and fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. We went down a flight of stairs until we reached a small office with no windows. There was a table, 2 chairs on one side, one on the other, and nothing else. I asked, "Am I being detained right now?" Neither one of them looked at me. The bigger one crossed his arms and said, "You made a threat against the vessel. Just sit tight." About 15 minutes later, the door opened and Mr. Vance walked in, still smiling, still looking like we were old friends about to grab a beer together. He sat down across from me and slid a printed form across the table. The top of it said, "Guest concern acknowledgement, not incident report, not injury report." The form said the guest expressed dissatisfaction with a dining area experience. That was how they described my 72-year-old mother being shoved down metal stairs by a crew member. A dining area experience. At the bottom, there was a line that read, "Guest agrees this matter has been addressed to their satisfaction," with a signature line underneath. I pushed it back across the table and said, "This isn't an incident report. This is a release form dressed up as customer service. I'm not signing anything that says I'm satisfied." Mr. Vance's smile got tight, like someone was pulling strings on both sides of his mouth. He leaned forward and dropped his voice. "I'm going to be straight with you, buddy. If you contact outside authorities over a minor dining area incident, the captain has the authority to restrict your movement on this ship for the safety of the crew. You and your mother could spend the rest of this cruise confined to your cabin." I stood up from that chair and said, "Are you threatening to put a 72-year-old woman on cabin lockdown because her son asked for an incident report?" He didn't answer. The silence told me everything. I said, "I want to go back to my cabin, right now." When I got to my floor, I turned the corner toward my room, and the first thing I saw was Dimitri. He was standing right outside my cabin door with a stack of towels in his hands, folding them real slow. But his eyes were on me the second I came around the corner. He wasn't folding towels. He was watching. I walked past him and opened the door. Mom was sitting on the edge of the bed, and the look on her face made my chest hurt. She looked smaller than I had seen her since the weeks right after my dad passed. She said while I was gone, a crew member she didn't recognize had knocked on the cabin door and told her that her son was being spoken to about a behavioral issue. They didn't ask about her arm. They didn't ask about her fall. They came to my mother's door while I was locked in a back room and told her that I was the one with the problem. I felt something click inside me. Not anger anymore. Something colder than that. I pulled out my phone. No signal. We were in the middle of the ocean, but I remembered something my dad once told me. Every cruise ship is required to have a satellite phone system available to passengers in emergencies. I just had to find it. I went looking for the older man from the guest services line, the one whose wife slipped on the same stairs. I found him on the pool deck with his wife, her wrist wrapped in a compression bandage from a pharmacy, not from a real doctor. He said his name was Jarrett. He told me they went to the medical center the night before, and the nurse charged them $200 for an ice pack and a wrap. No x-ray, no incident form. When Jarrett asked about filing a report, the nurse said the same thing Janelle had said to me. It was his wife's word against theirs. I told Jarrett what had just happened in the back room. His whole face changed. Then he told me something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Right after his wife fell on those buffet stairs, the crew member who helped her up told her the stairs were tricky for older guests, and that it happens all the time. Tricky for older guests. It happens all the time. If the crew already knew people were falling there on a regular basis and they were still not filing reports or putting up warning signs, this wasn't negligence. This was a pattern. They knew about the problem, and they were choosing not to document it. Jarrett pulled out his phone. He had taken photos. His wife's wrist that night, swollen and red. And the next morning, before the buffet opened, he went back up to those stairs and photographed the top step. There was a wet patch right where the floor met the first stair, and no wet floor sign anywhere near it. I told Jarrett about the satellite phone. He thought for a second and snapped his fingers. He had noticed a small sign the day before near the purser's office on deck 3 that said, "Emergency Communications," with an arrow. He stood up. "Two passengers asking is harder to refuse than one. I'll go with you." I stopped at the cabin first. Diane was sitting in the same spot, her bruised arm in her lap. She said, "Maybe we should just drop it. I don't want you getting in trouble over me." I sat down next to her. "Mom, Dad spent his whole career making sure ships were safe for people like you. I'm not dropping anything." She turned her head and looked at the framed photo of my dad on the nightstand. Mahmoud in his uniform, squinting into the sun on a dock somewhere. She stared at it for a long time. Then she said, "He would have done exactly what you're doing. Go." Jarrett met me by the elevator and we headed down to deck 3. The emergency communication sign was right there at the end of the corridor, and standing directly outside the door was one of the same security guards from earlier. He uncrossed his arms when we got close. "This area is restricted to crew." I pointed at the sign above his head. "I'm a passenger and I need emergency communication access. My mother was injured by a crew member, no report was filed, and guest services threatened to confine us to our cabin when I tried to report it. That qualifies." He reached for his radio. I said, "Your supervisor is Mr. Vance. He's the one who threatened us." He pressed the button anyway. While the guard was on the radio, Jarrett noticed the purser's office door was open a few feet away. He walked straight in and told the woman behind the desk he needed an emergency call to arrange medical care at the next port. She hesitated, then connected him to ship to shore. Less than 3 minutes later, Mr. Vance came around the corner walking fast, and for the first time since I met him, the smile was completely gone. I thought we had an understanding. His voice was flat. "No, buddy." I said, "We didn't. You threatened me, and I left. That's not an understanding." He turned to the guard and told him to escort us back to the main deck. That's when Jarrett came through the purser's office door. "I just got connected to ship to shore. Are you going to disconnect a passenger's emergency call?" Mr. Vance stared at him like he was seeing him for the first time. You could almost watch the math happening behind his eyes. One angry passenger was manageable. 2 passengers, 2 separate injuries, 2 families with photos and stories that matched. That was a problem that didn't go away with a tight smile and a form to sign. He looked at me. "Can I talk to you for a second? Just you and me." We stopped about 15 feet from the office. He turned so his back was to the guard and dropped his voice low. "I can upgrade you and your mother to a suite for the rest of the trip. Full onboard credit, complimentary excursions at every port. That's about $4,000 in value. All I need is for you to sign the guest concern form and we move on." I let that number hang in the air for a second. $4,000 to forget that my mom got knocked down a flight of metal stairs. $4,000 to forget that Janelle called her confused. $4,000 to forget that someone came to our cabin and told my injured mother that her son had a behavioral issue. This wasn't a man who felt bad about what happened. This was a man who had done this before. He knew the exact number that made most people stop talking. I said, "You're offering me $4,000 to not report that my mother was hurt and your crew covered it up. You know that makes this worse for you, right?" His jaw tightened. "This is a generous offer, buddy." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was even lower. "The next one won't be." I held his stare for a long moment, then I turned away and walked back toward the purser's office. Jarrett gave me a small nod. The phone was free. I walked into the office and asked the woman to connect me to an outside number. She looked past me toward Mr. Vance, who shook his head at her. She said, "Sir, I'm going to need supervisor approval for outbound calls to non-family numbers." I said, "The gentleman who just used the phone didn't need supervisor approval." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Jarrett stepped forward and leaned one hand on the desk. "I'll call the number for him. It's my phone time. I'm still connected." She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either, and that was enough. I read Jarrett the number digit by digit. He dialed and handed me the receiver. The line rang 3 times. I got transferred twice and put through to someone in the Maritime Crimes Division. The agent sounded like a regular person at a desk, calm, professional, asking me to slow down and start from the beginning. So I did. I gave him my name. I gave him my mother's name, Diane Mosley. I gave him the name of the ship and the date. I told him about the fall, the bruising, the wet napkin, the staff member who walked her back without filing anything. I told him about Janelle calling my mother confused and Mr. Vance using the same word. I told him about the 2 guards taking me to a windowless room and the threat about cabin confinement if I contacted outside authorities. And I told him about the bribe, $4,000 in upgrades if I signed a form that called my mother's fall a dining area experience. The agent listened without interrupting. He asked if I had documentation. I said yes, photos with timestamps. He asked if there were other passengers affected. I told him about Jarrett's wife and the wet patch on the stairs with no warning sign. The agent was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him type typing. Then he told me to keep everything. He said they would be coordinating with the Coast Guard. Then he said the words I had been waiting to hear since I walked out of my cabin that morning. An inspector would meet the ship when it docked at the next port. 2 days from now. He gave me a case number. I wrote it on my hand with a pen because I wasn't taking any chances. I walked out of the purser's office. Mr. Vance was standing exactly where I had left him. I stopped about 3 feet away. I said, "The FBI Maritime Crimes Division now has a case number for my mother's injury and for the pattern of unreported incidents on the buffet stairs. An inspector will board this ship when we dock at the next port." For the first time since I met the man, every layer of performance fell off of him. The smile was gone. The buddy was gone. What was left was just a face, still, blank, like a screen that someone turned off. He didn't say a word. He just turned around and walked down the corridor. The next morning, the first thing I saw was a piece of paper on the floor near the cabin door. Someone had slid it under during the night. Official cruise line letterhead, the fancy kind with the gold border. It said an incident report had been filed for the events of the previous morning in the buffet area. The matter was under internal review. The company values the safety and well-being of all guests. Then I looked at the date. It was dated for today, not the day my mother actually fell. Today. They had created a brand new report overnight to make it look like the system worked. I photographed the letter, the date, the timestamp on my phone next to it, and the gap under the cabin door. 20 minutes later, Jarrett knocked. He held up an identical letter, same letterhead, same wording, same date. They're building a paper trail to cover themselves before the inspector shows up. I nodded. Good. Now they're creating evidence against themselves. The next morning, I looked out the balcony window and saw land. The ship pulled into port slow. 3 people walked up the gangway as soon as it was secured. 2 in regular clothes with lanyards and clipboards. The third in a Coast Guard uniform. At the top of the gangway, the captain and Mr. Vance were waiting. The smile was back in full force. Mr. Vance was shaking hands with the inspectors like they were old friends coming aboard for a cocktail party. About 30 minutes later, a crew member came across the deck and said the inspection team wanted to speak with us in the guest services conference room. The room had a long table and windows along one wall. The Coast Guard officer sat next to a plainclothes inspector with folders open in front of them. On the other end of the table sat Mr. Vance, and next to him, a woman in a dark suit with a leather bag. Corporate legal, boarded at this port specifically for this meeting. They had called in a lawyer. The inspector said, "Please sit down. We'd like you to walk us through what happened from the beginning." So I did. I told them everything in order. The fall, the wet napkin, Dimitri, Janelle, the windowless room, the form, the threat about cabin lockdown, the crew member at our door, the bribe. I laid every photo on the table. Diane's bruises with timestamps. The post-dated letter next to the gap under our cabin door. The inspector asked Diane if she could show them her injury. She slowly pulled up her sleeve. The bruise was darker now, spread wider, the way bad bruises do over time. He photographed it from 3 different angles. Nobody said a word. Then he turned to the other end of the table. "I'd like to hear your response." Mr. Vance straightened up. The smile was back, the careful version. "This situation is regrettable, and I want to be clear that we take guest safety very seriously. There were some communication gaps between departments." The inspector didn't react. "Did you offer this passenger a cabin upgrade and onboard credit in exchange for signing a form that stated the matter was resolved?" Mr. Vance's eyes moved toward the corporate lawyer. She gave a tiny shake of her head. "I offered a goodwill gesture as part of our standard guest recovery process." The inspector didn't blink. "A goodwill gesture that was contingent on the guest signing a waiver. Is that standard?" The room went quiet. The lawyer leaned forward. "We'd prefer to address operational questions through our legal department." The inspector wrote something in his folder and turned to the crew member by the door. "Can you bring in the other passengers, please?" Jarrett walked in with his wife, the bandage still wrapped around her wrist. He showed them the photo of the wet patch on the buffet stairs with no warning sign. His wife told them what happened in her own words and what the crew member said when he helped her up. That the stairs were tricky for older guests and that it happens all the time. That last part hung in the air like smoke. The inspector turned slowly toward Mr. Vance. "So your crew knew these stairs were a recurring problem, told passengers it happens all the time, and filed 0 reports." Mr. Vance started to open his mouth, and the lawyer put her hand on his arm. Firmly, he closed his mouth. The Coast Guard officer looked up from his clipboard. The inspection would now extend to a full review of the ship's safety reporting records for the past 12 months. 12 months. Every incident on this ship for an entire year. I watched Mr. Vance's face when he heard that, and for just a flash, I saw something behind the professional mask. The look of a man who just realized the hole he dug was a lot deeper than he thought. A few minutes later, the corporate lawyer asked if she could speak with me in the hallway. The second the door closed, the stiff legal posture dropped. "The company wants to resolve this before it becomes a formal enforcement action. What would it take?" I had been thinking about this answer since the moment I hung up the satellite phone. A real incident report with the correct date, medical coverage for my mother and for Jarrett's wife, a written acknowledgement that your crew failed to follow safety reporting procedures, and Mr. Vance removed from any position where he interacts with passengers. She stared at me. "That's a significant ask." I looked her right in the face. "My mother fell down metal stairs because your crew member was careless. Then your team called her confused, refused to file a report, pulled me into a back room, threatened us with cabin lockdown, tried to bribe me, and sent someone to our door to scare a 72-year-old woman while I was being detained. That's not a significant ask. That's the minimum." She held my stare. I could see her doing the math, weighing the cost of giving me what I asked for against 12 months of safety records being torn apart by inspectors. "I'll take it to corporate." She turned and walked down the hallway without looking back. I went back into the conference room and sat down next to my mom. Diane squeezed my hand. Her grip was stronger than it had been all week. She leaned toward me and whispered, "Mahmoud is smiling right now." My throat got tight when she said that. I squeezed her hand back and looked across the table to the far end where Mr. Vance had been sitting. His chair was empty. He was already gone.